Again, thank you to Jason, Bathsheba, as well as Ben and Rachel and all the other folks who made being here together with you all possible, and thank you all for coming. So I'm working through a project, a very new project. So I'm looking forward to feedback. That's under the working title, "The Grounded Prophet," on June Jordan's intellectual thought and political vision. So I came to research in June Jordan in part because I was drawn in by her writing about land reform and property abolition. Although she is probably much better known as a radical black feminist poet, while I was teaching my students during a postdoc year at Smith College with the lovely Kevin Kwashi, who I must shout out in the audience, about teaching my students there about archival research, I happened on her correspondence with noted political scientist Francis Fox Piven, and they had a really interesting and robust exchange and some disagreements about land reform politics. So that drew me to Jordan's archive at the Schlesinger, at the Radcliffe, at Harvard, and especially to her yet unpublished drafts of a novel titled "Okay Now," and alternatively, "More Than Enough," which began as a pamphlet or a how-to guide on land reform, in which she drafted fictional versions of following Knopf's rejection of the how-to version as impossible or implausible for a black feminist poet to write. I think it's also important to note that she's writing this and trying to publish it after the kind of peak of Black Power publications, where these presses start getting tired of Black Power and don't want to publish anymore, which we could have a whole other conversation about that. So I've been working through the 1970s draft, the early 1980s one, and a 1996 draft that most certainly she picked back up after her diagnosis with breast cancer. I won't go into those or much of that today, but suffice it to say that Jordan, writing about a successful, if complicated, land reform project that takes place on a reimagined plantation near Ruralville, Mississippi, is fascinating in its resonances and departures from broader Black Power politics around land and other kinds of questions that she really draws out. The drafts also reveal so much about her process as well, which we could talk some about perhaps later, but the way that she really incorporates her own experiences through the vehicle of fiction, such that fiction is not necessarily about a non-true story, but rather a vehicle for expressing a deeper truth about a given reality, and particularly in relation to land in Mississippi and land and the kind of quest for abolition. So I want to jump in with reading something really under a better, more precise title called "Particular Lies and Places on Scale and Climate Catastrophe." So a set of low-hanging clouds arch over the horizon, fracturing further the glint of the sun. They're partially reflected back in the new greens of spring, the fresh lime-colored oak and maple leaves that have emerged along the road's edge. I ride along until the back roads with which I'm familiar, up past the community called Battery, give way to curves and hills that I cannot recall having encountered, despite how close I am to my born and raised community. Other than the sprinkling of a few basic Rambler-style houses, some trailers, and some larger houses set at various distances from the road, this is a near totally verdant landscape. The houses, including the more sizable ones, seem adrift in an open sea of green to the passing eye, moving at the speed of driving. Closely cut lawns give way to bramble, which in turn is subsumed by a young pine forest, which, as I make my way, forms a checker pattern interspersed between vast horizons of maturing wheat and young corn shoots. I'm on the way to an elder of the Rappahannock Nation's house, where, along with my co-conspirator, J. Richardson Yates, we are endeavoring to plant our organization Just Harvest's inaugural mutual aid garden. I bring a bouquet of fresh flowers, a small offering to this Rappahannock elder I've never met, as gratitude for her generosity in allowing us to work their family and their ancestral land in this way. Jay began planting here in the years prior to our larger mutual aid garden to provide meaningful transfers of knowledge between her grandmother, herself, and her children. Our mutual aid garden builds out from these intergenerational transfers that are already in motion between indigenous elders, middle generations, and youth. Jay has already broken up and covered clumps of earth and grass with fresh compost. She has created from the refuse of her family's dining and lawns as well as soil. As we hunch low at first in silence to plant tomatoes, watermelon, squash, corn, cabbage, kale, beans, okra, and peppers, as well as basil, marigolds, and some other flowers that will help to mitigate aphids, squirrels, groundhogs, and deer, the breeze carries the smell of pine, cedar, and soil. While Jay and I have been planning and working together for months after forming Just Harvest to help build local indigenous and Black-led food and environmental sovereignty and justice in the Tidewater, Virginia, this is the first time that we have taken this kind of direct action together, joining hands with the soil and learning about one another outside. Retrospectively, I'm struck by this moment. She is a descendant of the original stewards of this land, and I, a descendant of the people enslaved to clear those relations and to replace them with the plantation. And here I'm thinking about the plantation as a productive and juridical unit embodied together through the primary technology of the settler state property. We are here together in a small way, tending to the capital L land affirmatively, and we're treating that differently than land as lowercase l land, divisible, interchangeable parcels. Here, following LeByron, I mean by capital L land the complex relations that include forms of life not exclusive to people, the complex biophysical processes, infrastructures, and the residues of the past as ancestral presence as well as haunting. In distinguishing here between the ancestral, I'm naming a sought-after connection to the vitality of those who survived what has passed, and haunting in the sense of a reappearing form of social violence repeating into the present. The ancestral and the haunting here are commingled for us differently. They appear in different moments for us. For example, Jay comments a number of times that the soil isn't great as I pull large clumps of sandy yellow soil held together by grassroots. This is a passing sentiment that underscores the kind of reparative work that we seek to do in concert with the ecological, as it also recalls the historical displacements of the Rappahannock Nation to this area, to the most marginal of their hunting grounds, with the soil least compatible for intensive gardening within their historically stewarded territory. I groan as I crouch and Jay asks me if I'm okay. My audible exacerbation is a luxury not given to my ancestors, forced to toil at the threat of the lash and conditioned as property to compliance with forced extraction in the tobacco and later wheat fields that consolidated the Rappahannock's genocidal removal from the infrastructures of their inhabitants and living with this land. I feel in my body how the strain associated laboring even for right relations with capital L land and community, and am hit with a fleeting sinking feeling considering the conditioning of my ancestors, again considered disposable tools of clearance and capitalist cultivation. As Tiffany Lethabo King suggests, there are two different moments here, not in the sense of serial one and then the other, but compounding and sometimes clashing moments. They're constituted through differentiating forms of violence codified through race. This fiction assigns indigeneity in the Virginia context to the role of fodder for empire as subdued nature or subsumes their genealogies to the white power structures while confining blackness to spatial control, forced labor, physical coercion, disposability, starvability, and displaceability. As June Jordan wrote in another context, quote, "There's difference and then there's power, and who holds the power shall decide the meaning of the difference." In this context, in original Anglo settlement Virginia, whiteness and its legal and social architectures originating with the juridical and economic unit, the plantation, and outlasting that form as a singular one, shape how we do and don't relate to each other, dictate that we only encounter each other through the frame of effacement and violence. Our garden represents a hybrid genealogy, combining the foods of nourishment and possibility of indigenous cultivation that, as Jay emphasizes in her public pedagogy for Just Harvest, move beyond the three sisters, squash, corn, and beans for lots of other pairings, and those of the plot, Africans' partial indigenization of relations to the land and waterways here within the interstices of the plantation enclosures, and its enduring hold on the land through property. Our work here is the recasting of our bodily energetics outside the relations of domination, the conscription of the African descendancy as categorical slave underwriting plantation modernity through the provision of elemental energy prior to coal or oil's ascendancy, and embodying the primordial condition of nothingness, practically in the context of slavery, as that which can continuously be disaggregated and reaggregated through a form of ontological plasticity as the raw material of coloniality, violence, and domination, helping to reconstitute capital L land to land as property. And here also the conscription of the Rappahannock's territory and their people into narratives of permanent vanquishing, or relatedly the subsumption of their genealogies to authorize white authority by rooting and naturalizing colonial whiteness through first family descents in ongoingly disturbing Virginia lore about their first families all being related to indigenous people. We're working then in an impossible structural and discursive condition where the haunting of slavery and the residual affording possibility passed in intricate and unisolatable entanglement with that of a future and the people who are not supposed to be here, but whose insistence on presence and being and surviving meet. We are renewing relations in a way that re-signifies the difficult work of producing food, our relations to lowercase l and capital case L land, and the relations between our peoples. Let me be clear, we are not confronting any oil company or one of the banks that fund them, nor are we chained up at the tree plantations that surround this area to demand that they cease extractive industry. We are not poised here to rid the ocean of plastics or to end petrochemical production in the first place. We're not petitioning state government or the U.S. federal administration to change their life-threatening, life-ending policies. We are not confronting pesticides or GMOs used to govern the land and silently people's lives through the unexplained sicknesses and clusters of cancer likely resulting from an endocrine disrupting barrage of chemicals of which there is no or little accounting. We are, though, as we bend and dig and plant and backfill along these roads, working to heal relations between our communities and with this place. It is small and, in my estimation, a kind of revolutionary act for us to work in concert in this way, for us to work together with the land in an approach that eschews and quiets, if not totally absences, the violence of our shared and departing histories, here our inherited scripting of how we got here rather than capital H history. The messiness of colonialism, as King reminds, leaves none of us without blood on our hands in the ancestral sense and in the present, meaning even the people that we might look for as our models are not clear of the kinds of blood that entangle us in these two distinctive moments. The violence of white supremacy so often has served as the currency between indigenous and black people, even without any white person present, even in this place where discrete genealogy separating us into isolatable groupings is never straightforward. It is meaningful that we are learning from each other about each other's people and about how to grow and tend to this specific place, this specific parcel outside coercion and within a sense of community that we are cultivating together. Skeptics can rightfully point to the mismatch in scale. The phenomena bundled in the adage or the euphemism climate change is, of course, happening at a planetary scale and is threatening to extend even beyond the stratosphere as the ontological limit of resource and waste threatens to extend beyond the realm of the earth itself with untold catastrophic consequences here on the only place where we know how to live. Our frame of action, working together across our shared affiliation and appreciation for this place, our healing together on one small parcel with permission from an indigenous elder, is incommensurate with the scale of the bundle of issues described in contemporary discourses as the Anthropocene. We might be dismissed as naively small or perhaps even dangerous in our flirtation with mutual aid and resilience, which are easily appropriated and can sit right alongside the domineering violent earth stewardship, helping to legitimate unchecked sundering, pillaging, and expropriation, routinized through property and value that governs the earth in its current configuration by glorifying survival under the current conditions without interrupting or challenging them. I hope that I can move, especially using June Jordan, beyond this kind of accusation of naivete to make a call for the intimacy of place and for land at the center of our discussions and actions related to confronting the existential threat to the only verified life-sustaining planet in our cosmological neighborhood. In order to open this position, again, I'm going to engage with June Jordan's thinking, in particular, as I'm working through it for a chapter towards this intellectual biography. Foremost, there's Jordan's recursive use of phrasing, underscoring the preciousness of particular, sometimes individual lives and places that in the course of her life and writing expanded out from a consideration of Black urban residents to include, especially following her move from New York City to Berkeley, California, indigenous people, Blackened populations across the globe, especially Palestinians, Nicaraguans, and those forced to live the brutality of apartheid in South Africa, as well as the forest and other non-human forms of life. Jordan's repetition of the phrasing as part of her consistent political vision underscores particularity in the context in which racial categorization and corresponding designations of place, from the scale of the neighborhood to the relations of neocolonialism between the West and the rest, facilitate the smooth operation of extraction and death by replicating and extending the conditioning of an originally anti-Black fungibility associated through chattelization in the plantation, and move forward as a genocidal ecocidal project against indigenous people from in the West itself to the Blackened world. For Jordan, a corollary to this ethical imperative to protect each particular life extended from anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela to the individual trees in a redwood forest grove in Northern California was the related imperative to, quote, mourn the loss of every possible joyous life. This phrase emphasizes the elongated recollection of eclipsed life predicated on the senseless death of a woman that she called Sarah in one of these progressive essays that I'm drawing from tonight. Sarah's death, Jordan considered senseless, and in describing it, she refused the euphemism accident, bringing to view the conditioning that caused the brain hemorrhaging back through the driver's collision with the woman's body as she stepped into a crosswalk as part of the tolerable probability or miscalculation rather than an accepted line of disposability marked by the conditioning of infrastructures and the animus that shapes those through an anti-Black grammatical inflection of place. Mourning in specific, taken alongside the act of protecting individual lives, invoking accounting that exceeds the limits of accounting in the sociological or econometric registers of life through morbidity, death, reproduction, spending, labor, etc., at scales of social coherence produced through various forms of racial information. There's something unique in this kind of exacting precision to account for each and every, not simply in globular aggregate, but in the elaborated particularity, here the imperative of the poet and of the forms of poetics moving outside and beyond causal and other forms of narrativity. It's not that the particular has not been part of the arsenal of the descriptive acts condemning Black people to violence and subjection, the recognized individuality enacted through punishment under slavery and in its aftermath, as Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection underscores. Black people in particular reside in the sign of the flesh, marked by histories of the limit of life-ending violence that inheres from the conditioning as property and subject to the ultimate will of mastery, as Denise Ferreira da Silva underscores, very much vital from slavery into the proliferation of police murders and debt in our contemporary world. Jordan's insistence here is about the right to particularity and collectivity as mutually reinforcing conditions of possibility and of living. This is not a relinquishing of meaningful scale at the larger aggregate conditioning associated with infrastructures and the more distal forms of harm they induce. This is the use of the particularity of living a Black woman's life in the specific vulnerabilities induced by hypervisibility, the demarcation of alterity, the harm of various pasts that are harbored within the social architectonics of place, and the ultimate disposability these conditions created for the specifically killed. This, in her wider work joins a life-giving program of transformation the precondition of which for her was the destruction of property itself. Jordan's call for attention to particularity and specificity of living and dying encompassed an explicit rejection of American individualism, manifesting for her in the infrastructures of homogenizing suburban space and the emphatic insistence on an understanding of everyone as unique or special that practically eroded the development of forms of collective consciousness required for the securing of the species from a horizon of war and ecocide. Jordan embraced the conscientious exhumation of, quote, earlier systems of extended kinship that could be reworked into something suitable for the 21st century, which she held as the basis of a transformed society. Quote, beginning with the given, the physically familiar and comfortable family we discover as our own, we will have to cultivate the courage enough to reach for and then to embrace the unexpected, the uncontrollable, the completely unfamiliar kinsmen and women who must either become our comrades or our enemies as we work to preserve the species, she wrote. Jordan's thought suggests a resource for thinking through the ways that a life-sustaining alternative planetary organization comes as well, in addition to that kind of extending scale, through the deep recreation of place at the scale of what is knowable across the scales of communal quotidian traversal and making in our doing, and that in relation to the other scales of community outside that are large scale, but outside the tyrannical configuration of modern nation states, forms which legitimate themselves through the right to render disposable and to kill in the biopolitical, necropolitical nexus that's so present before us in our moment right now. Localism is, of course, not immune from violence. It can devolve into particularity that in turn justifies violent exclusion, cultivating further intensified conflict, violence, ecocide, and war. But local is also not always exclusionary, and I believe, as I'm trying to draw from Jordan with here, that the Black radical tradition, especially the Black feminist radical tradition, inclusive of Jordan, has a specific history of inquiry related to questions of place, staged across various contexts, under the specific conditions encountered by those seeking to radically alter social ecological relations and to tilt these to the sustaining forms in a context in which infrastructures were always or almost always tuned towards extraction for resources, including people. Jordan opened her August 1990 contribution to the Progressive, titled In the Presence of Giants, with the year 1963. With the imagery of Martin Luther King Jr.'s oration on the National Mall, the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham and the resulting deaths of 3 Black girls, as well as the South African regime's arrest of Nelson Mandela, met by Winnie Mandela's, quote, harrowing and militant vigil. Using a break characteristic of the emphasis underscored in her poetic writing, the paragraph that juxtaposes these iconic images, Jordan states, quote, almost nobody was thinking about trees. After the timing of the essay toggles between the trees as evidence that, quote, some things take time, and the quick clip of violence, which she described as fast, and that, quote, comes like a tornado, she moves into an anecdote around that develops around the bombing of Judy Bari and Darrell Cherney, members of Earth First, an environmental organization seeking to protect the redwood forests of Northern California from logging companies. Jordan then analogized what the media dubbed the Redwood Summer and the actions of, quote, these workers dedicated to survival of trees and hence to a life-sustaining environment for all of us with the Freedom Summer of 1964. For Jordan, the violence against Bari and Cherney illustrated the ways that their attackers drew on the playbook of America's penchants for racist violence, imitating the racist savagery that has haunted Afro-American existence, a virulent enmity that will also require dauntless legislative as well as direct attack before it will subside and become anything other than usual and unmitigated abuse, end quote. Here, Jordan's analysis underscores the shared roots and routes of anti-Black violence, political repression, and ecocidal destruction, galvanized in the moment of the bombing of these activists. Following another break affected through the repetition of, quote, some things take time, Jordan recollects that, quote, before moving west to California, she had never seen redwood trees and certainly had not thought to write about trees of any kind for any reason, end quote. Now, as her intellectual biographer, I see all kinds of like earlier 1970s land stuff, and I'm like, maybe not. It's not as radical, but it is significant that she names it in this way. She admitted that in that time, her, quote, notion of political urgencies did not encompass the preservation of things as against human beings, end quote. Despite her self-noted lack of environmental consciousness, again, her self-noted lack, she noted having an experience with a friend in Tilden Park in Berkeley around, quote, an ancient black oak tree, from which she noted an unease with her friend's certitude that the trees should perish if its displacement superseded the, quote, needs of nearby Berkeley residents. Jordan's unease stemmed from a lack of clarity about whether her, quote, own interests should easily supersede the living requirements of that amazing wild thing that arched and whirled and rooted down all at once, so close to where I stood breathing clean air, end quote. Jordan then, in the essay, picks up in time after she's moved to California and developed her explicit environmental consciousness, as she calls it, toggling this consciousness with a shared concern for Nelson Mandela's well-being, so toggling between Nelson Mandela and the Redwood Forest. Quote, and I have moved, I'm writing these words less than 20 minutes away from that old oak tree, and tonight my mind moves from anxiety about the safety and good health of Nelson Mandela to the safety of our common environment, and hence to the safety of trees. Jordan noted that in the presence of Mandela and, quote, inside the grove of the redwood trees, she felt a shared sense of serenity as something earned, something integral to the accomplishment of freedom. And in the next two breaking lines, I'm imaging this with her standing and feeling, quote, in the presence of Mandela and, quote, inside the grove of the redwood trees, the same reverence. She then moves to the aftermath of the bombing of Bari and Cherney, which drew her to the western offices of Georgia Pacific, the extractor of trees, where she saw, quote, a museum exhibit or sportsman's trophy of some sorts, documenting through a preserved cross-section the largest redwood tree known to have grown in Mendocino County, California. This tree, which had been cleared in April 1943 with a diameter at its base of 22 feet, invoked, quote, an appalling memorial for Jordan that, quote, the images of black men lynched and images of Native Americans massacred, which overtook her and made it nearly impossible to maintain her standing balance. In this context, Jordan understood deforestation as a rapacious force that threatened all life. And I think this is interesting in its resonance with some of the contemporary scholarship, but thinking this is 91, 92. Quote, deforestation is an uninhibited, greed-motivated, head-hunting Western style, and the hunters and the children of the hunters will not escape the meaning of the death of the redwood trees. In her January 1992 essay, also for The Progressive, Jordan documented and implored her readers to not forget the victims of the Great East Bay firestorm, an intensive heat event accompanied by the burning of 3 square miles of area near Berkeley. She recalled the experience of becoming aware of the fire through her body's visceral reaction to going outside that she shared with her dog, who refused to go into the heat, and suddenly strange atmospheric changes. After the feeling that perhaps they were about to experience an earthquake arose, Jordan heard the screams of her neighbors, who drew her attention to billowing smoke and ash that defined the horizon from the viewshed of her front yard. In the chaos that ensued from the sudden ignition of a, quote, wall of fire, consuming and silencing everything, including the people in its path, Jordan documented the incapacity of the media and the state to marshal an adequate response, with these entities, quote, scrambling with amateur maps and lunatic bulletins of information that prove contradictory. Quote, if you live there, evacuate. Don't drive, don't use the telephone, close the windows, close the doors, stay inside, please evacuate. These are the numbers to call for help. Please do not use the telephone. Please stay off the road, end quote. As her house began to fill with friends and friends whose lives and homes were threatened by the growing inferno, Jordan ventured out to view for herself the growing damage caused by the flames. And there's a number of times, especially after she begins writing for The Progressive in 1989, where she describes herself as a journalist. So just so we're added to the tags that Jordan takes up for herself, and that allows her to respond in real time. She also does the same thing during the 1989 earthquake, steps out and goes, and she goes to Nicaragua. There's a number of times where she uses her hat as journalist writer to do insurgent work in real time around unfolding questions. So she went out. She was struck by the rapid what she called fire-lit decomposition of trees, the choking smoke-filled air, and the sounds she heard across a distance of everything succumbing to the scorching 50-mile-per-hour winds. Despite the fire's consumption of lives, indiscriminate of the cost of a home, the destruction further inflamed the social violence underlying the patterning of the fire as, quote, some numbers began to monopolize media attention, $600,000 homes or $2 million homes, at the expense of an understanding that, quote, half the households lost to the fire had incomes less than $35,000, which never made it to the headlines. The media, as well as public officials, disavow in acknowledging that the poor had suffered and died the same flames, exposed the violent infrastructure constituted through property and dispossession as an ongoing act within settler California. Some people were not worthy of mention because they did not control significant financial resources or own their own homes. This was joined with the callousness that was demonstrated in the response to catastrophe by those who were already dehoused prior to the catastrophe, and in relation to the newly displaced. While the former, those who had already been dehoused, quote, might be given a can of Coca-Cola and told to beat it, the new homeless receive free counseling, hot food, and fresh salad stuff, the treatment for shock and soap and showers, and unlimited use of a phone. And I think we get here the kinds of ways that that Jordan's insistence upon at least naming and measuring these kinds of inequalities is very significant for our era of so-called climate refugees and other major displacements, although we could talk about the problem with those kinds of formulations as well. Property and access to the claims particularly of home ownership and whiteness in the wake of the catastrophic structure who could and would be remembered, and the calculation of loss, conflating the living of lives with the guarantee of state-sponsored possession in the form of property. For Jordan, this catastrophe invoked the violent subjugation and reterritorialization of California from indigenous territory and later Mexican land through Anglo settlement. It exposed the violent history that belied what she called California calm as a kind of day-to-day euphemism for the state's violent territorial consolidation and the ongoing relations of dispossessive action. Jordan's intimacy to individuality and particularity, alongside an intimacy with her engagements across larger scales of historical and geographic processes of violence, including an entangling genocide, ecocide, and slavery, and her esteem for anti-apartheid leadership in South Africa, right alongside and in an intimacy with individual trees in the redwood forest, as well as the various other threads that come through in my engagements with her political essays, index a critical formulation of Black ecological thought and Jordan's keen engagements. I want to break back to the Virginia mode and then probably turn it over to you all. We gather again at the Mutual Aid Garden, now fully in bloom and alive with bees and other pollinators. Jay has gathered about 100 pounds of zucchini, kale, lettuce, okra, and basil for our distribution. We contemplate washing it before we begin making deliveries. In conversation with one another, one of our other Just Harvest collaborators, Reverend Cornelius Holmes, we decide that given the heat of the day, it's best to deliver and to let people know that it's freshly cut and that they should thoroughly rinse and dry it prior to preparing it. After he pulls up, Reverend Holmes tells us that we are very close as the crow flies, at least in Virginianese, to his family farm just over another county border along the winding back roads. My partner and I decide to follow Reverend Holmes to his farm, where we meet and chat briefly with his cousins, one of whom is the primary worker of this land and the other who runs a horse farm on an adjoining parcel. These cousins, all retired workers from across various federal and state agencies, have returned to their ancestral land in the heart of Upper King and Queen County, Virginia, not to look out over this land passively during their years of rest, but rather to work the land, which I find astonishing. I'm like, listen, if I get a break, I'm not sure being a full-time farmer is what I'm going to do, as much as I love the ground and the soil and the plants. I asked them how they come to farming, and they disclosed that this was always an organic part of their being. From what I recall them saying in our brief conversation, when they were young, their father aided their grandfather who had worked this land, and they were also brought into the fold of cultivating it as very small children. When his father took up the responsibility of farming here, the cousin who is the primary farmer says that he had to continue returning pretty much every weekend from his life away in Lower Maryland and Washington, D.C. metro to continue to tend this land, providing additional hands alongside his elder father. Now that they have all retired, these cousins continue to work their grandfather's parcel, and I'm not sure, it may go back further than that. Given their ages and the generational depth that they have explained in response to my curiosity, and their grandfather and their father held this land against the great loss of land that began with the permanent collapse of agricultural prices in the 1920s, preceding the collapse of the stock market in 29 and the Great Depression. This is a remarkable retention given that narrowing window of Black holding in this area during the century since the second decade of the 20th century. The abundance of their holding, the fields of ripening squash and zucchini, and especially the freshly sown sweet potatoes that the cousins point to, make me at once proud and wash over me a profound and unmitigated sadness. I feel a deep sense of loss for what our communities must have been like when Black people had 20 and 30 and 40 acre parcels, could feed ourselves and use the excesses, and did use the excesses to support whole local institutional structures, including churches, schools, and other communal institutions that provide the basis of a partially sovereign and free lives in the uncertain zone between emancipation and the collapse of these worlds that really was sealed with the inauguration of the New Deal and its dissolution of fleeting Black possibility for autonomous rural lives in this part of Virginia. This is not a Jim Crow romance, so much as it is the lamentation of the dissolving power of large-scale state projects that refuse to attend to the specificity of local lives and modes of being. I could pause here and emphasize the parallel conditioning easily anticipatable with the marshaling of the New Deal, historical New Deal, and the formulation Green New Deal, but I hope that some of the emphasis that I've been drawing out here on particular lives and deaths will already have answered some of that, even though we could take it up more in Q&A. We head back across yet more unfamiliar back roads to Tappahannock to begin the distribution, and I am nervous. As much as I'm operating under an understanding of the radical potential of mutual aid, centering food to build transformative relations in our community as a start, I also know the ways that coercion through the threat of starvation has organized the de facto sumptuary laws of Virginia's Tidewater, emphasizing to everyone that only those who labor should eat, and that food without a price tag or the cover of some relationality marked through family in scare quotes is suspect. I start by delivering squash and kale to my aunt, for whom I've already arranged to make my first stop. We then move to my great aunt, who is just down the gravel lane of the trailer park from my aunt. After I sit with her for a few minutes to catch up, I'm strengthened in my resolve to contact those I've never met to see if they are interested in taking these vegetables. We emphasize that the food is free and that we don't want anything except for folks to look out for some of our upcoming gathering, which you saw a video from, around environmental and food justice that took place the following August. A few are hesitant. One white man flatly refuses, turning his face up in utter disdain at the likelihood and the notion that he could receive anything free from Black people or perhaps from anybody. One man says he can't do anything with the vegetables, but asks if he can take what we offer to his elderly mother, who he says knows how to make all these vegetables taste good, since she had grown her own garden before she moved into a trailer adjoining his, out of the more rural parts of a neighboring county, when she began to fail in health. We're only beginning this process. We're planning, and we executed, as you've seen, this late August gathering of Black and Indigenous artists, which Jason was a part of so graciously and delivered some real heat, filmmakers, musicians, dancers, and scholars. We hope to get, and we have been successful in getting a community demonstration garden confirmed by local county officials, which, believe me, has been uphill, because when we asked for access to public land, the first offer was for the old dump. Like, I'm not sure y'all getting the environmental part of it. We could clean up the soil, but it may take longer than we have time for food. We hope to model an expanding network of reciprocity through this kind of local food production, preparation, eating, and sharing together. We hope to proliferate this mode through schools and churches and partnerships that we've been in conversation and deep organizing around. This is a process without any guarantees. It does not answer large-scale climate catastrophe or the likelihood of expanding uninhabitability, linked with the question of, especially in this area, of well salination, land subsidence, and rising seas. It's only a seed that we can plant and hope to water. The matter of fruiting will take time, the sun, and our ongoing tending. We are starting with what is here, who we are, and how we can come together differently. We will continue to build connections beyond the local to create the infrastructures for other kinds of large-scale transformation, which we could talk more about, but first here, and then there, and then the world. Thank you.
From where do you get your seeds?
So, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So Jay is our primary farmer, and Jay is it's a practical combination. Some of it is some of the stuff that she has been developing, and certain things that she's grown consistently over the years that that have been passed along. And some of it's like with the mutual aid garden. This first round, it was through, as well as seed exchange that we had with folks who are associated with a farm. That's the name of which is escaping my mind, but with indigenous folks who live in Virginia, but who are Canadian by their connections through indigenous nations. So I think seed exchange is definitely a part of our thing. I'll say we've been trying to play with the experimental stuff, because part of the effort of trying to convince anyone in Virginia with recent memory of the toil, even if it wasn't slavery, the toil of working the ground, is to make it fun in some ways. So we've been playing with hydroponics and other stuff that, folks can play with in their own spaces with limited gardens, like trailers or apartments or other things that are part of the rural landscape. But also, again, that re-signify some of these things that make them interesting and new, and using that as a way to get into conversations about other kinds of food histories and knowledges, because our workshops have often taken place with a church with First Baptist through Reverend Cornelius Holmes. A lot of our we've had this last one successfully had a lot more youth. I think after the August program, we could bring young people along, but it tends to be elders. And we just started having conversations and opened it. Like, are there cures? Are there other things that you can remember that people used, or that people don't use anymore? And people not being able to name anything, but giving you stories about having fevers and their grandparents going to dig some root, and then, just activating those kinds of transfers to know that has been possible and can be possible in this landscape again. It has been critical. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really amazing talk. I have so many questions. I'm really excited to talk with you about them over dinner. But one big one that I think might be on the minds of lots of people in this room is the question of the scale of the plot. And you talked about how the scale of the plot is often debased in contrast to this existential threat of what you call the euphemism of climate change. And I really appreciated you calling attention to that. Too often, I think the work of a lot of people in this room that I know is often based on this ground. It's like, well, what's the solution? How are you really dealing with this broader issue? I'm just wondering if you could speak that a little more. I mean, you spoke to us almost as though we were on the same page as you, but what if I was confronting you saying, but what about the climate crisis?
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I would start with the Anthropocene and the climate catastrophe crisis, all of that being a novel way of naming processes that have been in motion since at least the colonization of the Azores, but particularly after the kind of violent, genocidal reterritorialization of the Americas. So I think, part of this paper is in response to particularly straightforwardly white social scientists engaging with certain questions and always pushing back against questions of intimacy and location as naive or stupid or unconsidered. And I think, but what the critical part that location and particularity make, the difference that they make is in, and particularly with the kind of critical engagement with somebody like Jordan, is to bring out, first of all, the anti-Black mechanisms and that are embedded within this race to a new kind of universality, and which hold as their fundamental blind spots the idea that a certain part of the ocean can be killed, certain forests can be sacrificed, certain species can die, and Black people and indigenous people in this U.S. context and beyond know that very well as the same old. So Virginia, we're being reterritorialized before our very eyes with new modes of property ownership that rest on top of and that are even parasitic to the old plantation form. So, there are the records, I could go through property records, there are the folks who own thousands and thousands of acres and their family probably passed that down for generations. But there's now green portfolios that own 900 or 1,000 acres here and there, and when you start adding together those profiles, it's a round of enclosure that's being mobilized as a green horizon. And that has no decipherable difference for Black and indigenous people in Virginia. So for right now, as it holds, the majority of the land is held by corn or wheat or some other grain that goes to the largest chicken feed operations that go from Western Virginia to into Pennsylvania and into New York State. The trees are held by companies that primarily process them, have historically primarily processed them for paper products. So now they are being reimagined in this great green transformation as biofuels. They still spraying us with pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. They are 40% of the children in Essex County, my home community, have regular hunger events, even though we're surrounded by acres and acres of land. So, in that green horizon, in that green global horizon, nothing has changed decipherably between our situation under one regime and the next. And in fact, it's not only now will we have to confront the local plantationocracy that has continued, we also have to find resources to fight a Canadian life insurance company that owns 900 acres hidden by 3 or 4 LLCs removed, or Mopus Group based in Jackson, Mississippi, that owns millions and millions of acres, especially in the South and in the Northwest, and of course in the Delta itself. So I think, and these are all supposedly green projects. They're all aligned with and hope to make catastrophic profit. I say catastrophic on purpose, catastrophic profit under a Green New Deal organization. Now, I certainly understand the ways that Green New Deal is challenged from the right, and I don't want to sound like I'm folding into that. But we have to have good historian hats for some things. Historians don't get everything right, or a lot of things right sometimes. But knowing that the New Deal is the nationalization of Jim Crow, even just a titular framing that suggests that is the horizon is need for pause. And especially when we know that the energetics are not being diminished. We're not using less carbon. we're adding biofuels to an ever-expanding energy regime. We're adding, solar to ever-expanding energy regime. We're not displacing any of the carbon use. So I think that's, and I don't think that scale is out of the, larger scales are out of the, like, we can just hold on to this hyper-local and expect things will be okay. That's not what I'm saying. I think what we've been trying to do, and Jason in a loose collective of folks as well through a Black Ecologies lab that we're gonna launch actually on Wednesday with a program, trying to build resources like the zine, film work, but also having folks move between different places that affect at least a kind of regional scale, that at least allow us to know each other consciously across different local communities. And I think there's a rich tradition from Cabral and Jordan to Huey P. Newton of, like, how do we reimagine rural and local, rural and urban, or local and global, that I think is Black ecology's intellectual history arm. I'll say it like that because it sounds funny. Arm to figure out, to work through and to draw out usable histories for. And I think Jordan already said all that. So I shouldn't say this because I'm being recorded. I would say it in a nicer way. Some of the people that I know that have the most to say about how this is wrong worked at the same institution as June Jordan, across halls from June Jordan, and didn't pay her any mind in 1990, and didn't give a damn about the environment in 1991. So we could talk about that at another time where I could be shadier without being recorded, but thank you for that question.
Hey, thank you for this. This is such a beautiful talk. I have consistently been struck by the line that you said about the redwood tree that was 22 feet in diameter, and June Jordan's own process of seeing that, and also being able to relate that to Black people being lynched and the displacement and violence against Indigenous people. And something that I struggle with, and I think maybe others do too, is like, what is the journey of getting more folks to sort of understand that inherent connection between those things look like? And not just in terms of our historical traumas and the violence of it, but also in understanding the connection between those three groups and other groups, in our restoration, in our collective healing, in our sovereignty. What is the process of, like, helping ourselves and also helping other people get to that understanding?
Thank you for that. I think Jordan's own process is instructive, like, actually, and I think what I want to say is part of why I consider her kind of, like, I'm using prophet, at least in this working title, is often the cutting edge discomfort that some of her insight brings. It's in many frames, but this is one of them in particular where, I mean, in some way, and I'm not going to conflate her with a kind of certain terms in posthumanism necessarily to just make those that close together, although I think there is shared and understanding. I think she's doing this in 91 in a way that sees apartheid, slavery, genocide, herbicide, ecocide as one set of processes, and trying to disrupt and interrupt those. I think Jordan's mode is part of this project, and I didn't say more about the kind of overall thrust of this work, is also to not replicate but intimate the kinds of, or engage in the kinds of genre crossing work that Jordan does, to make, again, to use poetry, to use epistolary, to use essay, to use plays, to use children's literature in all of these keys to move hearts and thinking, right, around these kinds of questions. And I think that's where I'm at too. I mean, that's why I shared the zine, some of the film work. I was going to show 11-minute short film, the plot film that I've been working on, but I think I'll reserve that for the seminar in terms of time. But that's my approach, is like working on all the keys. And I think, and also learning what genre differently teaches, like different genres teach us, and recognizing the power that goes into remaking those as well as the kind of colonial logics that help continue to replicate this vision that the forest is logs or paper, or, as Clyde Woods kind of put it, and I can never remember that phrasing, but the deer become fur, the people become slaves, the trees become forests. I think I think we're also at a tipping point for that kind of consciousness, even within Black studies. Of course, every name just flew right out my head for something I wanted to say. The decolonial Malcolm Ferdinand's work. He calls the slave trade the human deforestation of Africa. I'm like, that's the kind of work and recognition that we need. And I think it is very hard because, again, certain liberal formulations that don't want to rid us of property take stranglehold over our horizons to say that nothing else is possible. But again, Jordan was working across all these different genres, and I think we have that capacity. Sometimes it's double book. Sometimes it's like, maybe if you finish your process, your committee only really need to know about your dissertation, even if you're doing some other stuff. But cultivating those other modes is one way. And organizing, I think, saw Joy James give a talk recently talking about the kinds of, at Ahmad Hayes Green's conference on Africana religion and theory, talking about the ways that that part of the kind of critical epistemological necessity that is often left out of thought about epistemology is action. So having these kind of radical formulations that, the other thing is, I'll say, we face this in terms of Black ecologies. The hounds are always like, or the case when it comes to certain theorizations, in overwhelming those theorizations. But it's that little lag time between the theorization as something novel and the institutional consumption of that we have some working possibility. And that's hard because it's fleeting. So I guess what part of what I'm saying is Jordan's ongoing peripatetic journalistic formulation of like, I'm going out in real time and moving and engaging and talking is also a critical part of how we keep ahead of that subsumption of our ideas and thoughts and critical power. Thank you.
So thanks for this great talk. It was super interesting. The thing you said towards the end about how you really appreciated the idea of people having their own farms where they can share all of their vegetables with their communities, really, it reminded me of yesterday when I was, or yesterday? What day is it today? Yeah, yesterday I was at someone's house and they had a mug that said, all I want for Christmas is the means of production. And I thought that was the same idea, but very useful. But actually, I just wanted to ask something really basic, because I don't know almost anything about U.S. history. So I was wondering if you could just explain what you mean by the New Deal and how it was a continuation of Jim Crow.
Yeah. So I mean, the New Deal is a fix in relation to capital in the 1920s crisis that really begins with the agricultural collapse, and which also precipitates Black land laws through mechanization and federal policy that basically helps to enclose what had been a patchwork of smaller Black and indigenous and other modes of cultivation that were worked collectively increasingly into the modern industrial agricultural farms that are our, concentrated feeds, concentrated grain, and all of that kind of production. So I think the New Deal helped to it was contradictory. I mean, there's aspects of the New Deal, like at a certain point, certain integrative aspects at the level of the cabinet and the so-called Black cabinet that give us sort of superficial inclusion of Black communities in some ways that we can anticipate from the 80s, right? Like as being similar to that, which again is an uncomfortable juxtaposition that I'm making because I'm talking about is denaturing at the 80s as being similar to its creation in the in response to the Depression. But again, it was a capitalist fix that was designed based on Keynesian economics to shore up consumption, right? And that, of course, led to more consumption, which is the greatest peak. The New Deal and the kind of post-war Fordist states are where we get the great spike. That, along with the atomic weaponry that is required to ensure all of that order. That's one of the golden spikes, depending on how you classify. And I think the Green New Deal is equally wed to an idea of a continuous horizon of consumption that's not remarkably new at all in any kind of way. And that doesn't promise, it has no promise or guarantee actually in real ways of carbon or whatever declining. It just is adding new modes of energetics that consistently expand. So we get kind of politics of, well, we don't have coal production here, but this is why scale is important. We know those same companies moved to Southeast Puerto Rico, as Hilda Llorenz's work points to, and then moved to Colombia and other places where dirty coal is acceptable. So it doesn't decrease that horizon of ongoing constant production doesn't do anything. I wanted to say something about the small scale farmer stuff. I don't think it was. It certainly wasn't a romance. But there's a window after Jim Crow. After emancipation and before Jim Crow consolidated in the early 20th century. Virginia doesn't get the first Jim Crow laws until 1900 and after. There's economic restructuring that happens prior to that includes the clearing of the forest after the Civil War, the enclosure of water and other lands that even under the plantation regime had been relatively open to use. That what black people did in that little window of use, they start to materialize as a full landscape in Virginia in the post-emancipation period. They built churches in 1865, 66, up to the 1900. They use those. They do small-scale agriculture and oyster cultivation to support those. They build that goes up in scale to the state where they're building Virginia Union University, right? An epicenter, if you go with Claudrena Harold's work of anti-Jim Crow thought, right? So that Jim Crow responds to that and seeks to tame it and destroy it. And then the New Deal amplifies that as a national modality of spatial and economic organization. So that's what it's not that we don't need new energetics, it's that we need new energetics that address the real contradiction. We move from slaves to coal to oil in an uninterrupted fashion. And we need to interrupt that extractive technology that blackness provides in all of its forms that are now being held up to support, by gunpoint extraction of rare minerals and the return of slavery in our contemporary with real force, right? So thank you.
JT, thank you so much. It's amazing to have you here. I wonder, when you were talking about June Jordan, I think one of the things that you're more familiar with her archives than I am, but incompleteness was not a hindrance to June Jordan in thinking, writing, and doing. I think whereas there are some writers for whom completeness is a mode and a practice, and I don't mean to suggest that one is better than the other, but when you're talking about June Jordan's capaciousness of genre and the way in which she moved in different forms to try to get things done, getting things done wasn't about completeness. And there's a citation that I think Toni Morrison makes that I'll find and send to you because I think that'll be useful. I just wondered if you might say something about, in your book, Dark Agoras, one of the things you're doing is kind of pushing back against the city, urban / country binary as a form that racializes black people, or even the way that Tiffany Lathabo King is pushing back against land and sea and the way in which those constructions racialize Black and Indigenous people. And I see that across this work of yours, and I just wonder if you say a little bit more about how you're trying to deploy relanguaging the racialized terms that come to identify or over-identify or over-ideate or misideate, say, Black people, either with land in one negative construction, or with the city in one negative construction, or with the country in one negative construction. Would you say something about that?
Yes, thank you so much. Always the wonderful question that you hope for from Kwashi, one of my favorite people. If you haven't seen how and why I'm gushing, I think so. I want to say something about to go into draft. First of all, I think Carlene Ferrari's work, Randy Gill Sadler's recent publication in Oxford American, both of these Black literary scholars turn into draft from people who are otherwise quite productive, and wondering what is useful in that. And I think I've been in a longer form of this, really thinking with okay now, in part because the way that it brings out sometimes, even as the most successful in terms of numbers, publication-wise, Black writer in the 20th century, or probably maybe writer in the 20th century with 27 books. Like, why do you need to go to what she couldn't publish, or what she couldn't, in a sense, not as her own incapacity, but publishers' rejection, because they said, you don't know nothing about this as a Black woman, right? And I think, so I think that's critical, that even with the height of literary success, that Black women are still being rejected for some of the things that Jordan wrote this from, she wrote a how-to guide in 70, has a fictional draft by 80, and another fictional draft by 96. And we just get this sense of like the transformation. She called, in one of the write-ups for this in 71, prior to it being rejected, she repeatedly talks about Mississippi America as one formulation. And I think, in some ways I've gotten asked the question, like, isn't she just reproducing a kind of northern, like, response that says Mississippi is the worst and that's the tag? But I think what she was doing through that hyphen was quite significant in trying to both, of course, underscore like Malcolm's and others understanding that everything below Canada was Mississippi, and also probably Canada too. That's another story. So I think she was trying to do, the OK Now draft that I'll just talk through it to hopefully start to get at some of the question about disrupting sort of racial signifiers that are either rural and isolated or urban and isolated. That's a critical like conjunction. The OK Now draft is unromantic, and that's why, again, a kind of grounded prophecy. It's not like she's like, this is going to be utopian. But all these people are gathering in this land reform project on a former plantation in Mississippi in the fictional version. And of course, she's very much influenced by her trip in 1970 to visit Fannie Lou Hamer and other members of local organization work that had inspired her. She went there originally to write her New York Times essay, Black Home, Mississippi, that was published, I believe, in like 70, maybe. I forget dates, I'm a bad historian sometimes. But that she, and Knopf wanted her to write that book, but Knopf wanted her to write a congratulatory, beautiful, everything is better in Mississippi, because that was the essay version in some ways. Not knowing that her version, the essay version, just was not saying that everything was perfect in Mississippi, but understanding that that also the organizing work that people had done in Mississippi also needed a public celebration. When Knopf says, "Oh, write a celebratory thing," she rejects that off the top. And it's in her trip to Mykonos. She goes to Rome for the American Academy Environmental Fellowship, Design Fellowship in 70-71 with support through a weird relationship. We could talk about that with Buckminster Fuller. He's a weird person. Anyway, his letters for her supporting her are a little strange to me. But anyway, Buckminster Fuller, She goes to Rome. She's there for about 3 or 4 months, and then she takes this trip to Mykonos. And she's struck by the contradictions between Mykonos and Mississippi. And I think it's starting to get at what you're pointing to. She is denaturalizing deprivation. She gets to this place, and these people are eating, they eat well. They're not starving. And maybe this is her mischaracterization as an outsider of Mykonos, but she's like, it's a rock. You can't grow anything here. So she comments in an essay that she publishes later, sometimes the sea is rocky and they may not have all of what they want to eat for like a week because the sea had storms, but they're not starving. She had just come from Mississippi, which, as she wrote in her letters to Francis Fox Piven, in the More Than Enough version that was the pamphlet at one point, that Mississippi had the most hunger counties in the world, right? But was the most fertile land in the world. That contradiction, I think, often gets read onto blackness, right? It's both the local plantocracies understanding that cotton should cover all the land and at the expense of being able to even feed themselves half the time. But there's a whole nother conversation about the self-destructive aspects of white supremacy. And I think she plays with all these different people who come to this place, not just because they're not coming because even a black power sentiment about being black. Like they come to this place from very different structural positions within that. One of the main characters, and of course names are flying out of my head, but one of the main characters comes to this land, had been in Mississippi, born and raised, left to go to Atlanta, as we might understand a kind of 1970 circulation of black people in the South. And is brought back by this movement. There's a kind of what she kind of classifies as a kind of bougie lawyer that's a part of this mix. There are people there's a couple that is leaving Brownsville, Brooklyn. They've already decided to come to this land transfer project in Mississippi, and when right as they're about to leave, their apartment catches on fire. So there ain't no returning for them. So I think they're not being organized or galvanized. And the original call comes out of in the novel, in the drafts, comes out of a black politician who's just remarking on the 1970s oil crisis by the 80s draft. So, and he calls together out of a crisis of power. But that crisis of power, when all these people come together and start talking about it, first of all, it's fractious, it's not romantic. But second of all, they start to imbue that sense of power not just as fuel, but as the fundamental contradictions that led to the fuel crisis and therefore are leading, to ecocide and ongoing afterlives of the plantation itself. So I think she she disrupts why, and one of the people, I should say, one of the local people is a farmer, as a civil rights leader from Mississippi, and he's at the peak of his disgruntled feelings about the legacy of that. So there's everyone's coming out of desperation. And by the 96 version, after she has been diagnosed with terminal breast cancer and other stuff, or what becomes terminal breast cancer, it's very explicit. The opening pages say, not only, first of all, it says the first oil crisis was a false one manipulated through markets. She said this one that organizes these people to come is the real crisis, like the end of oil and the end of life. The fish die, all the birds are dying. That's why people come to this place by the 96 version. So there is a shared ecological vulnerability across urban and rural geographies. And she's pointing out the shared phenomena in the More Than Enough pamphlet. It's a whole breakdown of the political economy of Senator Eastman's land easements, right? Like she went there too, you know what I'm saying? Probably why they didn't publish it. It's coming for Senator Eastman. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you a sense of the ways that it's about, they do have some shared characteristics, but there is no easy umbrella of like their blackness that might facilitate that transition, and it's messy and fractious because of that. But it also shows the kind of power that can be derived through this vulnerability, through this collective, and it's remarkably frustrating. You don't get an end. You know what I'm trying to say? You don't know where this goes. But thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so inspiring. I wanted to ask you about. I was very intrigued by the man in the trailer who said, "I'll take the food to my mom," and intrigued because I'm also interested in organizing around food sovereignty in community, and what arises is that that kind of move requires so much social change, even from things like maybe some people don't even know how to cook. And I'm wondering if you might have something to say around that aspect of organizing in community, and what are some of the obstacles or things we might learn about just here.
Thank you.
This is actually good because I think we have some similar thoughts here. First of all, I just want to thank you again. This is a very enlightening talk. I do some research with Asian American queer and trans farmers, and I heard when you're talking about the cousins who were retired, and you said like when you were retired, like you don't necessarily want to be a farmer. Like that's very hard work, and also I think on top of that, something that I had a conversation with people last week, and they were talking about is that for most of their life they've been indoors. They like didn't spend a lot of time outside. They didn't spend a lot of time doing a lot of heavy lifting and like physical labor. And I think that for them, this is partially like a liberating, but also a test for them is that they have to discover new ways of movement and embodying the life they want to see. And I'm thinking about like I think for some of us, there's a goal of like repeopling these lands and like having folks return to land and heal through that. There's also this challenge and this opportunity of reorienting our routines and our bodies to that kind of lifestyle, and reconciling with the ways that our movements have been gendered and racialized and subjected to, position our bodies in certain ways, and how do we get into a kind of movement that is in harmony with living in on the land and creating these kinds of food systems and communities that we want to live in.
Yeah, thank you for both of these great questions. It is remarkably hard in Virginia, as I was trying to point to convince anybody, white, black, indigenous, to be like, let's go outside and start the toil of a major garden, let alone an actual farm, because people have serious memories of, that kind of grueling labor, as well as serious, memories of like foodlessness in relation to and out of force being, necessitating certain things like canning and other things that are time-consuming work. They're not easy or they're not straightforward, and they've been particularly gendered, right, and racialized, as you all are pointing to. So I've been trained as a community organizer in two very different modes, and one of them is the like classic door knocking, like political campaign. Go out, knock on people's doors, numbers, or how many people did you talk to, that kind of thing. The other kind is like cultural organizing, and the people that at the time ran the Zilphia Horton Institute at the Highlander that did the cultural organizing thing, their motto was like a pot of greens. Like, it's slow, it's long, you sit around it and eat it together, and that doesn't have some end objective, but those kinds of transformations are critical for how we reinvest our bodily energetics within new systems, abolitionist systems. And I think that again, it's remarkably hard, which is why we started with stuff that feels novel, even as it facilitates the conversations about stuff that is older and shared knowledge. It feels like, well, we're doing something that's cool. Just like you can't take out like the awe factor of like it's something different and novel. That's part of it. And that builds people slowly into conversations. I also think in rural Virginia, everyone drives everywhere. There's no public transit. The shared public spaces that are maybe considered a commons have a courthouse that arrests a lot of black people and lock them up, the pedestal of a Confederate monument that the top has been taken off of. And the land is 40 miles of riverfront, and only about 40 feet of that actually you can access. So even though the water itself is a kind of commons through kinds of legal doctrines that are already problematic with settler hegemony, but even that you can't access because, so part of it is also returning through my own research for myself in relation to this community is what were able to accomplish when, again, not romantically, but when the Fauntleroy family, who I've seen in oyster records, gets 30 acres of land and works a half an acre of oyster land and uses that to negotiate their labor in both and modulate their labor in both such that they do less, and that doing less is generative of more oysters into the future. Stuff like that, when they were doing it, was just considered dereliction or indolence. So I think the climate requires us to get to the basic formulations of even how we taste. I think we have to do a whole reimagining of cultures, of our cultures, in ways that refer to and draw forward what's possible out of these genealogies that I've been trying to reference through the plot and through indigenous cultivations and other formulations in other places, and that also are responsive to other scales all at once. It's a lot of work. And meanwhile, we're actively being fought against by, just in Virginia, passive chemical inundation is enough to kill off generations, and has since the 50s when they started spraying. So I think it's an uphill battle, but I think those kind of new relations are the only possible future. Again, I already gave the critique of what the large scale, not to say that we don't need large scale, but if we just jump if we just jump to a global or a post-lunar vision and horizon, we're gonna die, just straight up. So I think we need to reimagine culture outside of alienation. And in Virginia, I'll just say this and then I'll hush. This is an area where people were, I do part of the pedagogy through these, like the political educational parts of this, is to address the reality of the use of starvation and glut as discipline and violence since the plantation. Our public had people, their ears nailed to the pillory because they stole a hog in a place where hogs ran feral or cattle ran feral. They stole it. So part of it is addressing all that, but also those memories of otherwise horizons that we can come up with and out from these histories. Thank you both. Thank you so much, everyone.